Hello, I'm Sandy Moss. I'm a retired biologist, and I'm here to talk today about a subject which is sort of interesting, at least to me. It's harpoons. And harpoons is a tool, really, that were used in hunting from time immemorial. Now, a harpoon is like a spear. A spear is really something that is jabbed into an animal in order to kill it. Right? Not a very pleasant thought, but the spear stays attached to its pole, its handle, and the animal is subdued at that point. A harpoon is different in that the head of the harpoon, the dart, the point, comes off after it's been pressed into the animal. And then the animal is usually subdued from a rope which is attached, or a line which is attached to the harpoon point that now is embedded in the animal. And this, as I said, has happened for a long time. Harpoons were used by American Indians, Native Americans, from the time they first came to this continent, which was 10 or 15,000 years ago. And harpoons have evolved. They've been developed in different ways for different kinds of animals, larger, smaller, etc. And what I want to do today is show you a few examples of harpoons and talk a little bit about them. Some of them are relatively new, some of them are relatively old. And we'll talk a little bit about how they look, how they're used, or how they were used, and something about their age and other characteristics of them. So to start with, I'd like to mention a late harpoon. This thing here, which we'll show you a picture of in closer detail. Point that was used for harvesting swordfish off the east coast of the United States. And these were used in the 1950s and 1960s. No longer are they used because swordfish, it turns out, are much easier to catch on hook and line, long lines, than they are by harpoons. But this is a swordfish harpoon, or a swordfish dart, as it's sometimes called. And this would have a metal forepiece called the foreshaft, which fits into a hole at the end of the harpoon. And that would be loose. That is, this would be thrown into the swordfish, and the pole would disengage, would come out of this hole, and this harpoon is tied to a line which is attached to a longer line, which then is used to recover the swordfish after it has been tired from the fight it puts up when it's been harpooned. It's, as I said, this is a new one. This is 1950s. It was a technology which was very important in coastal New England in the 1950s. The next harpoon here, in terms of age, is this big one. This is a whaling harpoon. This was used in the late 19th century and into the early 20th century to harpoon whales off our shores and really all over the world. And it consists of the same features. It has a head, or a dart. It has a foreshaft which is attached to the head, and the foreshaft comes down and then is attached to a wooden handle. And this has all been wrapped. This is an original harpoon that's got its original wrappings to it to attach the harpoon socket to the wooden handle. And this rope, which is attached here, would run back to the main whale line, or harpoon line, back to the whale boat, which might be 600 fathoms long, 3,600 feet long, to fight the whale. This has a very heavy handle. And in use, what happens is that this harpoon would be thrown from a boat, a whale boat, and would come down and embed itself in the back of the whale. These harpoons weren't stabbed. They weren't ordinarily jabbed directly into the whale, but rather they were pitch poled. That is, the harpooner would hold his hand out at the bottom of this and throw it up in the air, and it would come up in a big arc and land on the back of the whale. And the weight of the handle, the impetus, the momentum of that handle, that big heavy handle, would drive the tip of the harpoon deep in the whale to get through the blubber and ultimately into the flesh, which would secure it. The handle would sometimes break away. Okay, it would sometimes stay with the harpoon throughout the fight, but in either case the idea would be to get the whale to tire itself out. Now this harpoon is a type that was used in New Bedford, the place where most whaling was done from the United States, in the mid-19th century. And its unusual feature is that it toggles. That is, when it goes into the animal and the animal starts to pull against it, it flips up like that. We call this a toggling harpoon. And that means that this harpoon is less likely to pull out of the animal than it would be if it were without that. You know, these surfaces would not present enough resistance to hold the harpoon in. So to keep the harpoon from pulling out, they developed this toggling harpoon. And it's kind of interesting, this toggling harpoon was invented in New Bedford by a man named Lewis Temple, who was a blacksmith, and he was also a person of color. He was a black man who in 1849 or 1850 developed this type of harpoon. He never patented it, never made a dime off it, but it became the standard kind of harpoon that was used in whaling in the 19th century, from 1849 right through to the end of whaling in New Bedford, about 1910 or so. Sort of interesting, I have a book that I'll perhaps show you some pictures, or not pictures, but pages from, and this is a hardware store book from New Bedford in 1851, and Lewis Temple came into that store and bought a set of hinges for a door. He paid 12 cents for them. And his name is in that book. And I like this book because I'm holding a book here that was in the same room with Lewis Temple in 18. Okay, that's the whaling harpoon. And that's from the middle of the 19th century, 1850s, up to about 1910 when whaling stopped. The next harpoon I want to show you is a different harpoon, and it's made of ivory. This is walrus ivory from the tusk of a walrus. It's roughly 6 inches long. It's got a hole in the middle here. That's where the harpoon line would be attached to it. It's got, we'll see in a close-up, it's got a groove or a slot in the front of it. This was used in the Bering Straits by Eskimos, that is, Native Americans from the Western Arctic that we call Eskimos, as opposed to those from the Eastern Arctic, New Greenland or Greenland, Northern Canada, that we call Inuits. So this is an Eskimo harpoon head that was probably used about 1800. We're in the 1700s, and the way we know that is that the slot here for a blade is a slot that's made for a piece of thin slate which has been polished and put in here just before it was used. The Eskimos prepared these slate blades very carefully and put them in little wooden boxes, and then when they went out for whales or walruses, this is probably used for walruses rather than whales, okay, they would take a slate blade out of their box, force it into that groove, and then be ready to use the harpoon. If they didn't use the harpoon, they could take the blade out and put it back in the box to keep it from being broken. So we know that this was for a slate blade as opposed to a metal blade or even a stone blade. They used stone blades too, flint blades, chipped just like we think of Indian arrowheads. But those were usually wrapped in sinew around the edge, and the metal blades, which came later, were pinned with a pin through here. So this doesn't have the pin, it doesn't have the recess for wrapping it with sinew, so we know this was for a slate blade. It's a very graceful thing. If you had this in your hand, you'd see the color is sort of lemonish, lemon yellow. It's got a hole in the back for the foreshaft to come in, And it's got this beautifully crafted sort of streamlined hole and guide for the line that holds goes back to the hunter and back to his kayak or back to his umiak, his larger boat, which they used in walrus and whale hunting. This, as I said, is about 1800, so we're talking 200 and some odd years when this was made, and it's acquired this nice patina, this yellow patina from that time. Very well crafted, but no engraving, no markings on it. This one, which we'll look at, a sealing harpoon, again from the Bering Straits region in western Alaska, between Alaska and Siberia, actually from an area called St. Lawrence Island, which is just 50 miles off the Siberian coast, but it's in American territorial water. And that was a place where there were quite a large population of early Eskimos, back to over 2,000 years ago. Now this isn't 2,000 years old, but it's what we call a Punuk era harpoon. It's got, as you'll see, fine engraving on it with lines, some of them curved, some of them not. So that dates this to about between 1000 AD and 1500 AD. So this, at the very least, is 800 years old. And it is unusual in some respects. One, it has a slot for the foreshaft from the harpoon here, but that slot is what we call open. It's not a closed groove. It has two barbs at the back of the harpoon here. And most unusually, it doesn't have a blade in the front part of the harpoon. Rather, it has provision for two blades, one on each side. And one of the blades survives here, and it's made of a seashell. It's not made of metal, it's not made of slate, it's made of seashell, and you can see the ribs of it, like a scalloping, which is on the blade. So it's what we call a side-bladed Eskimo harpoon, for seals mostly, not for walrus or bigger game like whales. Has some other characteristics to it, but it's got a hole here that the line comes through, goes through here, and then back to the hunter, which has this harpoon mounted on the edge of a wooden shaft that he throws or stabs at the seal. And it's got these decorative lines on it. So here we have an 800-year harpoon, old harpoon, and here we have a 200-year-old harpoon, and here we have a 150-year-old harpoon, and here we have a 50-year-old harpoon. Now, Lewis Temple invented this toggling harpoon that we saw before, but he didn't really. That wasn't a new idea. This harpoon from, say, 1500 or 1000 years ago also toggles. When this is embedded in the animal and pulls back, this rotates, flips up, so that the animal, it won't pull out as easily. This one you can more easily see how this would toggle. This toggles and it flips up like this, and so the pull is this way, not this way. So the toggling harpoon that Lewis Temple came up with isn't a new invention. That was around 2,000 years before he thought of the idea, which is sort of interesting. Now the last harpoon I have here is probably the most unusual one. Okay, it's a nice, graceful harpoon. It's got a real sharp point. This is made out of whalebone, the lower jaw of a sperm whale, which is very heavy, very, very dense bone. It's got this long gap between the single barb and the base of this. This harpoon is made to be wedged into a very long pole. I've got a pole here which isn't quite as long as this was used, but the poles that these were put into was 10 or 15 feet long, and it was split at the end, and this would be wedged into that pole and tied with sinew around the pole, so that when this was essentially stabbed into an animal that was the prey, it was usually seals or small whales, porpoises, this would pull out, and there would be around it a hide line, a rawhide line, which would be wrapped in this gap, and the line would only be 15 feet long and would be tied halfway up this pole. And the idea is the fellow would stab this into the prey, let's say a seal, and the seal would take off. He probably would sneak up to it on, when the seal is beached out on a rocky beach. He would stab it and the seal would take off, and this would essentially toggle too. It's sharp on the top here so that it would toggle if it was stabbed in deeply enough. And then that line would come back to this pole, and the guy would stand basically in his canoe or on the beach and would fight it holding it with two hands, or maybe 2 or 3 people lined up pulling this. The animal couldn't get far away, just 20 feet or so, because the line wouldn't be long, but it would ultimately tire and subdue, and they could then kill it with clubs or knives or whatnot. Now this was done in a strange sort of place. This was done in the Tierra del Fuego, right at the tip of South America. The lower part of Argentina merges into the Patagonia, goes across the Straits of Magellan, and on the other side is the Tierra del Fuego, and that's where this was made. From a beached whale. They didn't kill these big whales. They probably got a beached sperm whale and used the whalebone from that. And this was done in the 1800s, but probably before that. The very first contact with these people, which are called the Yagan Indians in the Tierra del Fuego, was probably when Magellan went through the Straits of Magellan. Certainly we know that Charles Darwin met them in the 1830s when he was coming with the Beagle through that same area. And we know also that there was an expedition called the American Exploring Expedition, which occurred in the early 1840s with a naval commander, Captain Charles Wilkes, who led a fleet of 4 or 5 vessels out into the Pacific, and he stopped in Orange Bay or Orange Harbor in the Tierra del Fuego, and he met these Indians. And actually, in a prior trip there, his captain, Captain Fitzroy, took 4 of them back to England and kept them in England. One of them died there. They met the Queen, and they did this and they did that. They learned to speak some English, and then they wanted to go home. So Fitzroy took them on the HMS Beagle with Darwin back to the Tierra del Fuego and let them go. Let them go. They went back to their homeland, met the people they had missed for 4 years. But this is a relic of that kind of harpoon use. And people who are experts in harpoons think of this as the most primitive harpoon that we know. It's one that is pulled out as a harpoon should, come out from a foreshaft, but it does so in this odd way of coming from a big long pole like this with a short line. So that's a very, very interesting kind of harpoon. So here we have 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different harpoons, and there are many others. Virtually every Aboriginal group of humans across the world developed harpoons. And most of them were toggling harpoons. That was, as I said, Lewis Temple got a lot of accolades for his invention, but it really wasn't anything new. And I hope you've enjoyed this.